They told you giants never existed, that they were just myths, exaggerations, medical anomalies. But what if that's not true? What if, less than 200 years ago, giants were real, living among ordinary people, getting married, having names, being photographed, and then they all disappeared? Not in ancient times, not in some lost civilization, in the 1800s. At the exact same moment, newspapers were reporting giant skeletons. Those stories vanished. At the exact same time, a single man began gathering living giants and putting them on display. And here's the part no one can explain. Every single one of them tried to have children, and almost none of those children survived. No wars, no plagues, no mass extinction. Just the bloodline stopping. Completely. So the real question isn't, did giants exist? It's, why did they suddenly disappear? And why are we not supposed to ask about it? Everyone talks about the bones. Newspapers from the 1800s described skeletons too large to be human buried in mounds, unearthed by farmers, measured in impossible proportions. Reports appeared across America, from Ohio to Kentucky, written in calm, factual language, as if nothing about it was strange. And then they stopped. The bones were sent away to museums, to institutions, to places like the Smithsonian. After that, the trail goes cold. No public records, no preserved exhibits, no explanations, just silence. Historians later dismissed these accounts as exaggerations, hoaxes, or misidentified remains. But the volume of reports says otherwise. Different states, different witnesses, same descriptions. Messy skulls, unnatural height, bodies that didn't fit accepted human limits, too consistent to ignore, too widespread to be coincidence. Yet today, almost no one talks about them. It's as if an entire chapter of history was quietly removed, filed away, labeled irrelevant, and forgotten. But bones don't just disappear. And when evidence vanishes this cleanly, it raises a question no one wants to answer. What exactly was buried, and why was it never meant to be found? What nobody discusses isn't what was buried, but what was still walking. While reports of giant skeletons faded, another set of records quietly remained: census documents, church registries, photographs. Not legends, not bones, but living individuals described with exact heights, addresses, occupations. People who stood over 7 feet tall, not hidden in myths but standing in family portraits, attending events, signing legal papers. They weren't treated as mysteries at first. They were neighbors, sons, daughters, unusual, but real. The shift came later, when their existence began to be reframed. Instead of evidence, they became curiosities. Instead of questions, they became entertainment. Their names were recorded, but their significance was reduced. And yet, the pattern is difficult to ignore. These individuals appeared within a narrow window of time, across different regions, with no clear explanation linking them. No shared ancestry that could account for such extreme height, appearing again and again. Still, official narratives insist they were isolated cases, random, rare. But when rare begins to repeat itself with precision, it stops being random. It becomes a pattern, and patterns, especially the ones that span continents and decades, are not accidents. The most unsettling detail isn't that these individuals existed, it's what happened after. Records show marriages, documented unions recognized by churches and law, couples who built homes, bought land, and planned for families like anyone else. They were not isolated anomalies drifting through history. They tried to continue their lives forward. And yet, when you follow those records one step further, something breaks. Births are listed, but not futures. Children appear briefly in documents, then vanish from any continuation of lineage. No descendants, no extended family lines, no generational growth. In cases where children survived, they returned to average proportions, as if whatever defined their parents simply stopped, completely. No transition, no gradual decline, just a clean end point. It doesn't behave like normal genetics, where traits dilute or reappear unpredictably. This behaves like a cutoff, a line drawn with precision. And when multiple families, in different regions, across the same period, all reach that same abrupt ending, it stops looking like coincidence. It starts to look intentional. Episode 2, Part 1. Anna Heining Swan, entered the world already defying expectation, not just in size but in trajectory. Her growth did not slow, did not plateau when it should have it accelerated past every known boundary of childhood development. What made her case more unsettling wasn't the numbers, but the consistency. No deformity, no loss of coordination. She moved, spoke, and learned like any other child, only on a scale no environment was built to support. Daily life became a series of adjustments, doorways, clothing, even simple movement required constant adaptation. Yet mentally, she remained sharp, disciplined, and focused on a future that seemed entirely ordinary in her mind. She studied, practiced, planned. There was no indication she saw herself as anything other than human. But the world around her began to shift its perception. Neighbors didn't just notice her, they remembered her. Visitors came not to greet, but to observe. The attention grew quietly at first, then steadily, until her presence no longer blended into community life. Without leaving home, she had already become something people talked about in a different tone. Not fear, not admiration, something closer to curiosity, controlled, measured, and growing. As Anna grew older, the limits weren't in her body, they were in the world around her. Classrooms became impractical, not because she couldn't learn, but because nothing was built to fit her presence. Desks, ceilings, even the space between rows turned ordinary movement into disruption. Teachers couldn't ignore her, and classmates couldn't look away. What should have been routine education slowly turned into isolation. So learning moved elsewhere, into private study, into long hours of reading, into skills she could develop alone. She became fluent in literature, comfortable with performance, capable of holding attention not through spectacle, but through intellect. Yet every achievement came with the same underlying problem. There was no clear place for her to exist in society. She was too capable to be dismissed, but too different to be integrated. Opportunities that should have been open simply weren't designed for someone like her. And that absence created a gap, one that wouldn't stay empty for long. Because when society doesn't know where to place someone, something else eventually decides for it. The decision didn't feel like a turning point at first, it felt like an opportunity, an offer structured with precision, designed to solve every practical limitation at once: space, income, education, stability. It wasn't presented as exploitation, it was presented as access, a way to step into a world already prepared to accommodate her size, her presence, her difference. For someone who had spent years adjusting to environments never built for her, the idea of entering a place where everything was scaled correctly carried a quiet appeal. The transition was immediate. New surroundings, new expectations, new routines. But with that shift came a subtle change in how she was seen, not as a student, not as a future professional, but as something to be positioned, introduced, and observed. The structure around her was efficient, controlled, and carefully managed. Schedules replaced freedom, visibility replaced privacy, and without any single moment marking the shift, her identity began to move from a person adapting to the world to someone the world was now arranging around. The system she entered wasn't built for discovery, it was built for presentation. Every detail was calibrated: how long she would be seen, where she would stand, how she would be introduced to an audience that came not to understand, but to witness. She was no longer part of a community, she was part of a schedule. Names were adjusted, descriptions refined, narratives rewritten, to make her more compelling, more marketable, easier to categorize. It wasn't chaotic, it was organized, deliberate. And she wasn't alone inside it. Others were already there, each with their own story, reshaped into something simpler, something that could be consumed quickly. Differences were emphasized, backgrounds altered, identities compressed into roles. The environment functioned smoothly because it removed complexity. No past, no future, only what could be displayed in the moment. And within that structure, something subtle happened. The question of why these individuals existed began to fade, replaced by something easier to accept, that they were there simply to be seen. The scale of it became clearer over time, not a single case, not a rare exception, but a growing collection. Individuals from different regions, different backgrounds, appearing within the same controlled environment, as if drawn into it by design. Some had military pasts, some came from rural families, others from distant countries, yet they all converged into the same system, defined by the same single trait. Height became their identity, overriding everything else they had been. And the more of them appeared, the less unusual each one seemed. What should have raised questions instead normalized the phenomenon. Audiences stopped asking how this was possible and began accepting it as entertainment. The concentration was too precise to ignore too many in one place, within one period, under one management. But instead of investigation, there was presentation. Instead of research, there was routine. And slowly, the existence of multiple giants in a single space stopped feeling extraordinary. It became expected, controlled, and most importantly, contained. Control didn't stop at appearance, it extended into identity. Stories were adjusted, origins reshaped, backgrounds rewritten to fit narratives that audiences could easily accept. Real histories became optional, replaced by versions that sounded more exotic, more distant, more explainable. The more unfamiliar the story, the less people questioned it. Accuracy wasn't the priority, coherence was. A consistent narrative made everything easier to process, easier to sell. And within that framework, individuality began to disappear. Personal details were stripped down to essentials, then rebuilt into something simpler, something repeatable. What mattered wasn't who they were, but how they were presented. Over time, even they had to move within those boundaries, adapting to roles defined for them. The system didn't need force, it relied on structure, on routine, on expectation. And the longer it continued, the harder it became to separate what was real from what had been constructed. Because once a person is consistently introduced as something, eventually, that becomes the only version the world is willing to see. Outside that controlled environment, the world looked unchanged, but the distribution of these individuals told a different story. Reports surfaced from distant regions, describing unusually tall families, siblings sharing the same extreme height, clusters that shouldn't statistically exist. They weren't isolated cases scattered randomly across decades. They appeared within a compressed time frame, then seemed to fade just as quickly. Rural areas, small communities, places far from public attention, these were the origins. And yet, many of those individuals eventually surfaced in the same few locations, as if drawn along invisible lines towards centralized points. There was no formal network documented, no official process explaining how they were found, contacted, and relocated. But the pattern suggests coordination. Not chaotic discovery, but systematic identification. Because finding one such individual might be chance, but finding many, across distances, within the same years, requires something else entirely. Something organized, quiet, and effective enough to leave almost no trace behind. The more closely you examine the timing, the harder it becomes to ignore. The rise in documented giants didn't stretch across centuries, it surged within a few decades, then declined just as sharply. This wasn't a slow evolutionary pattern or a long-standing genetic trait passing through generations. It appeared concentrated, almost compressed into a specific window of history. During those same years, public interest grew, exhibitions expanded, and records became more detailed but only up to a point. After that, the documentation thinned. Not gradually, abruptly. Fewer reports, fewer mentions, fewer individuals appearing in any official capacity. It's not just that the phenomenon became rare again, it's that attention shifted away from it entirely. What had once been recorded openly became something no longer pursued. And when a pattern rises quickly, becomes visible, and then disappears from focus without explanation, it suggests more than natural decline. It suggests that something changed not in biology, but in how the subject itself was allowed to exist in public view. By the time the pattern began to fade, what remained was a controlled narrative, simple, contained, and easy to accept. Explanations were standardized, reduced to familiar terms that required no further investigation. Individual cases were no longer connected to each other. Each was treated as separate, unrelated, and fully understood. The earlier concentration was reframed as coincidence, the clustering dismissed as statistical noise. Without a broader context, there was nothing left to question. And that was the most effective part, not removing the evidence, but redefining it. Because once something is labeled as already explained, curiosity stops, inquiry slows. The need to connect details disappears. What had once looked like a pattern dissolves into isolated facts, each too small to challenge the larger picture. And in that shift, the phenomenon didn't need to be erased. It only needed to be simplified. Once identities were simplified, they became flexible, easy to reshape, easy to replace. Names shifted, origins changed, timelines adjusted without resistance because there was no stable reference left to compare against. A man could be introduced one way in one city and differently in another, with no expectation of consistency. Audiences didn't track accuracy, they consumed impressions, and those impressions were carefully constructed to guide perception, not reflect reality. The more distant and unfamiliar the story sounded, the more believable it became within that setting. This wasn't accidental distortion, it followed a pattern of controlled variation. Enough truth to anchor it, enough alteration to redirect attention. Over time, even documented details began to blur, conflicting accounts existing side by side without correction. And in that ambiguity, something important was lost, not just who these individuals were, but where they actually came from. Because once origin becomes unclear, connection becomes impossible. And without connection, no larger pattern can ever fully form. Alongside shifting identities came a quieter layer of control movement. Where they could go, when they could be seen, how often they appeared outside structured settings. Visibility was no longer neutral. It was regulated. Time outside public display wasn't freedom, it was managed absence. The less they were seen in ordinary environments, the more unusual they seemed within designated ones. Daily life narrowed into defined spaces, predictable routes, limited interactions. Not enforced through obvious restriction, but through design. Housing placed strategically, schedules aligned tightly, interactions filtered through necessity rather than choice. Over time, their world contracted not physically, but socially. Fewer unplanned encounters, fewer unscripted moments, fewer chances to exist outside expectation. And as that range shrank, something else grew stronger, dependence on the system that organized everything around them. Because when every aspect of life is structured externally, stepping outside that structure stops feeling possible. Not because it's forbidden, but because nothing beyond it has been left accessible. And then came the final shift: value. Not personal value, not individual worth, but measurable, assignable value tied directly to visibility. Attention translated into income, presence into profit, difference into a fixed price. The more extraordinary the presentation, the higher the demand. The more controlled the exposure, the greater the return. It wasn't hidden, it was structured into the system itself. Contracts, agreements, percentages, all designed to quantify something that had once simply existed. Over time, identity and value became inseparable. To step outside the role wasn't just a personal choice, it meant losing the framework that sustained everything. Housing, income, stability, all linked to maintaining that defined image. And within that structure, a quiet dependency formed. Not forced, not overt, but reinforced through consistency. Because when a person's existence is continuously translated into numbers, into tickets, into schedules, it becomes difficult to separate who they are from what they generate. And once that line blurs, stepping away no longer feels like freedom, it feels like disappearance. Within that system, connections still formed quietly, without announcement, outside the structure that defined everything else. Among those who shared similar lives, understanding came naturally, without explanation. There was no need to justify differences or adapt behavior. Presence alone was enough. It was in that space that Heining Swan and Martin van Buren crossed paths. Their meeting didn't carry spectacle at first. No audience, no framing, no narrative assigned to it. Just two individuals recognizing something familiar in each other. Not in appearance alone, but in experience, the same adjustments, the same limitations, the same unspoken distance from ordinary life. What developed between them wasn't built on curiosity or display, but on recognition, a rare balance where neither had to be redefined or reduced. And in a world that constantly structured who they were, that kind of connection held a different weight, because, for the first time, the system wasn't shaping the interaction. It was simply absent. What followed moved quickly, but not carelessly. Their relationship didn't need to be constructed, it aligned naturally, as if both had already understood the path long before taking it. When they appeared together, attention returned, but this time it carried a different tone. Not just observation, but amplification. Their union was framed, announced, elevated into something larger than the two individuals involved. Invitations expanded, venues grew, audiences multiplied. What could have remained private was repositioned into something public, structured, and widely witnessed. Every detail became part of a narrative: location, timing, presentation, all arranged to maximize impact. It was no longer just a relationship, it was an event, and within that shift, the balance changed again. What began as something personal was now moving through the same system that had shaped everything else around them, not altering what they felt, but redefining how it would be seen, recorded, and remembered. After the attention settled, what remained was something far more difficult: building a life beyond the structure that had defined them. They stepped away from constant display and moved toward permanence. Land, construction, stability. The house they designed wasn't symbolic, it was necessary. Every dimension recalculated, every space expanded to match bodies the world had never planned for. Doors widened, ceilings raised, furniture custom built from the ground up. It wasn't luxury, it was adaptation made permanent. And within those walls, they tried to shift from being seen to simply living. Daily routines replaced schedules, private time replaced performance. For the first time, control wasn't external, it belonged to them. But even in that independence, the reality remained unchanged. Everything around them had to be built differently just to function normally. And that difference didn't disappear when the audience did. It stayed quiet, constant, shaping every moment of the life they were now trying to create on their own terms. Inside that house, scale became routine. What once drew attention outside now blended into daily function: movement, rest, conversation, all recalibrated to proportions that finally made sense. Tasks that had required adjustment in the outside world became seamless within these walls. Chairs supported without strain, ceilings no longer interrupted motion, spaces allowed for presence without compromise. It created a rare sense of alignment between body and environment, something they had never fully experienced before. But that alignment came at a cost. Everything beyond those walls remained unchanged. Stepping outside meant returning to limitation, to observation, to a world that still wasn't built for them. So the house became more than shelter. It became a boundary, a place where normalcy could exist, but only within a defined perimeter. And over time, that contrast sharpened. Inside, life was stable, predictable, controlled. Outside, it remained distant, misaligned, and watching. Routine settled in, but it carried a quiet purpose beneath it. Every adjustment, every structure, every carefully measured space pointed towards something they had not yet achieved: a continuation. Their lives were no longer about adapting to the world or being shaped by it. They were preparing for what might come next. Conversations shifted, plans extended beyond the present, decisions began to account for someone who wasn't there yet. The house, the land, the stability it all formed a foundation for something larger than themselves. And with that came a different kind of pressure. Not external, not imposed, but internal and persistent. Because for the first time, the question wasn't how to live within their difference. It was whether that difference could continue, whether what defined them could move forward into another life, another generation. And unlike everything before, there was no system, no structure, no precedent to guide them, only expectation and uncertainty. When the moment finally came, it didn't follow any known pattern. The anticipation had been structured, prepared for, measured against everything they understood, but the reality moved beyond those expectations immediately. Time stretched, conditions intensified, and what should have been a transition became a threshold. The scale that defined their lives now shifted into something far less controllable. Every variable increased, every margin narrowed. This wasn't just another adaptation, it was a point where physical limits were tested in ways no environment could compensate for. The same difference that shaped their world now carried weight in a completely different context. And within that moment, it became clear. Not everything could be adjusted. Not everything could be engineered to fit. Some boundaries remained fixed, regardless of preparation, and crossing them came with consequences that couldn't be predicted, controlled, or reversed once they began. The outcome was immediate and irreversible. What had been anticipated as a beginning ended before it could take form. Records would later reduce it to a single line: birth noted, duration measured, conclusion finalized, but those entries fail to capture what actually occurred. The scale that defined their lives reappeared in the most fragile context, where precision mattered more than strength. There was no gradual decline, no window for correction, just a brief presence, then absence. And with it, the first realization that this wasn't an isolated difficulty, it was a limit, not imposed by environment, not shaped by circumstance, but inherent. The same trait that made their existence extraordinary now revealed a boundary it could not cross. And unlike everything they had adapted to before, this was not something that could be rebuilt, redesigned, or approached differently the next time. It was final, immediate, and left no space for adjustment. They tried again, not out of denial, but out of the same logic that had carried them this far: adjust, prepare, improve conditions, and the outcome should change. This time, everything was more controlled, more deliberate, timing monitored, environment optimized, support increased. Every known variable accounted for, every prior limitation considered. It wasn't repetition, it was refinement, but when the moment arrived, the pattern didn't shift, it intensified. Duration extended, strain increased, and the margin for stability narrowed even further. What followed wasn't unexpected in structure, but in scale. The result pushed beyond anything previously recorded, reaching a point where even documentation struggled to describe it accurately. And yet, despite all preparation, the outcome aligned with the first: brief existence, followed by absence. Not failure of effort, not lack of care, just the same boundary, encountered again, under different conditions, with the same conclusion. After that, the pattern stopped being personal. It became observable. Other cases, in other places, began to align in the same direction. Different families, different pairings, yet the outcomes followed a similar structure. Either no continuation at all, or a shift back to average proportions that carried none of the defining traits forward. There was no gradual transition, no partial inheritance, just two distinct results, repeating across unrelated cases. And the more examples surfaced, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't isolated to one couple, one circumstance, or one attempt. It extended outward, consistent enough to be noticed, but never formally connected. Each case recorded separately, each outcome explained individually, never brought together into a single framework. But when viewed collectively, the conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. Whatever defined these individuals did not persist. Not by chance, not occasionally, but systematically. And once that realization settles in, the question changes. It's no longer about whether they existed, but why their existence could not continue. Once the pattern is clear, the timeline becomes impossible to ignore. The rise, the concentration, the abrupt disappearance, it all fits within a narrow window that behaves nothing like normal human variation. Traits don't emerge this strongly across multiple individuals and then vanish without trace, not without leaving fragments, partial continuations, anomalies in later generations. But here, the line doesn't blur, it stops, cleanly, and that kind of precision doesn't align with randomness. It suggests a limit that was reached, not gradually, but definitively. Something that appeared, expressed itself fully within a generation, and then encountered a boundary it could not pass. And that boundary didn't shift, didn't adapt, didn't weaken over time. It held, across locations, across families, across different attempts to continue forward, which leaves a possibility that's harder to accept than any anomaly, that this wasn't an incomplete process. It was a complete one with a fixed endpoint built into it from the beginning. By the time the pattern had fully played out, what remained wasn't evidence of continuation, but absence shaped with consistency. The individuals were still documented, their lives recorded in detail, yet beyond them, the line ended without extension. No branches, no scattered cases reappearing decades later, no delayed resurgence, just a clear boundary where presence transitioned into non-existence. And what makes it more difficult to reconcile is that nothing external explains it. No widespread event, no environmental shift, no recorded factor capable of affecting multiple, unrelated families in exactly the same way. The conditions around them changed, industries evolved, public attention moved on, but the outcome remained identical, which suggests that whatever defined them wasn't influenced by circumstance. It followed its own internal rule, independent of location or time. And when something behaves with that level of consistency, it stops being unpredictable. It becomes structured whether understood or not. What remains today isn't a mystery hidden in darkness, it's a pattern left in plain sight, fragmented across records that were never meant to be connected. Birth certificates, marriage documents, property records, medical notes, each one complete on its own, yet incomplete when isolated. No single document explains anything, but when aligned, they form a sequence that points in one direction: emergence, concentration, termination, not fading ending. And the most striking part is how ordinary the records appear. No warnings, no classifications, no indication that anything unusual was being documented beyond simple measurements and dates, as if the significance was never acknowledged or deliberately overlooked, which creates a final contradiction. The more normal the documentation looks, the more abnormal the pattern becomes, because something that follows such a precise arc appearing, peaking, and disappearing within a defined window should have drawn attention. Instead, it was recorded and then allowed to pass without question. After the final cases were recorded, the shift wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. No announcements, no conclusions, no acknowledgement that anything had ended. The records simply stopped expanding. New entries no longer appeared, and existing ones remained unchanged, frozen at the point where the line had already closed. Meanwhile, the world moved forward. Architecture adapted to standard proportions, medicine advanced within expected ranges, and public attention settled into explanations that required no revision. What had once stood outside those limits no longer needed to be addressed because it was no longer present. And over time, absence became normal. The lack of continuation didn't raise questions, it blended into the background. Generations passed without encountering anything that challenged that stability. And with each passing year, the distance grew not just from the individuals themselves, but from the idea that they had ever existed as part of the same human timeline at all. What remains now isn't disappearance, it's residue. Structures that no longer match modern proportions, objects built at a scale that serves no current purpose, details preserved without explanation. A doorway slightly too tall, a chair built higher than necessary, walls extending beyond practical design. Individually, they mean nothing. Together, they suggest adjustment for something no longer present. These remnants weren't removed, they were absorbed into the environment, stripped of context, reclassified as curiosity or design choice. Without explanation, they lose significance. And over time, repetition dulls recognition. What once required intention becomes background. The physical traces remain, but their meaning dissolves. And when context disappears, even evidence can exist without raising questions. Because without a reference point, there's nothing to compare against, nothing to confirm that what you're looking at was ever out of place to begin with. In the end, nothing was officially erased, only disconnected. The records still exist, the names remain, the measurements were never altered. But without continuity, without descendants, without reappearance, they no longer challenge anything. They sit outside the present, sealed within a completed sequence that doesn't extend forward. And that is what makes it so difficult to confront, not because the evidence is missing, but because it leads nowhere. No future reference, no modern equivalent, no ongoing example to anchor it in reality. Just a closed loop. And when something begins, expands, and then ends with that level of precision, it leaves behind a final question that cannot be simplified or dismissed. If this was natural, it should have continued at least in some form, but it didn't. Which means whatever it was, it followed rules we still don't understand.